Hello and good evening to everyone. I think this is a very important discussion with regards to acknowledgement, whether or not there are mistakes, certainly at the local level, political level, scientific level, because without acknowledgement, there's very little opportunity to move forward. So we have a very challenging time ahead of us where things still don't seem to fully align. How do we get beyond it? So, part of what I'm trying to do here is that I'm bringing in experts who have an understanding of psychology, mediation, because at the end of the day, the solutions lies with a collaborative approach to how we need to think. And that's really what I think that we need to be doing at this point. And so it's great pleasure that I have with me Dr. Christian Buckland and Jane Gunn. And I'm going to ask them one at a time to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Christian. If you just do a quick introduction of yourself, just have to unmute your mic.
Sure. Thank you, Philip. So my name's Christian Buckland. I'm a psychotherapist over in the UK, and my qualifications include Doctor of Psychology in Psychotherapy and Counselling. And I've got a special interest clinically in eating disorders, and more recently, I've got a specialist interest in working with people who have been injured by the COVID-19 vaccine, as I'm the psychological advisor to UKCV Family, which is the largest support group in the UK for COVID vaccine injury sufferers.
Excellent. Thank you, Christian. And Jade, if you could just unmute your mic first.
Yes, thank you, Philip. Hello. Yes, I'm Jane Gunn. I'm a former lawyer and I now work as a mediator. I've worked in the medical negligence field and I help people to resolve conflicts, specifically in times of change, challenge and crisis. How do we manage some of these conflicting situations that we find ourselves in at the moment?
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Now, I guess that part of the reason why I thought this was such an important conversation is because I think we are on the brink of some very challenging scientific, clinical, political scenarios. And I guess the first place to start would be to say, what is your take about where we are now? What is your personal opinion as to where we are now before we start discussing anything else? Anybody want to go first?
I'll allow ladies to go first.
Thank you, Christian. Actually, I had a quote for you, Philip, and it says, "The past cannot be changed, forgotten, edited, or erased. It can only be accepted."
I see. Yes.
And so I think we're at a stage where one of the things I say about managing in times of conflict is we have to accept, acknowledge, and actively manage where we are. And I think that's possibly where we're at the moment.
Excellent. And what about your thought, Christian?
I think that there's been so much suppression of, especially in the bit that I've sort of been involved in heavily over the last year, of people who have been injured by it, that the dam is actually starting to break because there is so much talk and the censorship has lifted so much, especially on certain platforms, that people are now talking about what has happened, their lived experiences. This is my story, this happened to me, and this is my suffering. That it's no longer we're no longer able to hide away and pretend this isn't happening. We are seeing it. So I'm very glad that we are seeing a shift there. But it's also meaning, how is the rest of society going to adapt to this new kind of information where people start to sort of recognize that actually certain people have been injured or people have died from something that was labeled as something safe and effective?
These are tough conversations, and it's the reality that the first thing that people do, and I'm going to be talking about this a little bit from a clinical perspective, but everybody looks inward first. Everybody just wants to move on. Why can't we just move on and put it all behind us? What's wrong with that?
Well, I think that you know, for certain people that we can want to move forward, maybe they don't see that there's any problems that are happening at the moment. So actually, why is everyone questioning anything? Why are people kind of making a big deal about something? We've just moved on. Things to do with COVID was from a couple of years back. So why are we still there? Certain other people, I think the psychological aspect of starting to see there are some problems and mistakes were made, or maybe deliberate things were hidden from us. You know, we've seen the unethical use of psychology being used in behavioral science. And I think people want to move on because actually we don't really want to acknowledge what's happened. I think that is a huge part. What does it mean if I accept that I was lied to, or I was given misinformation by the kind of parental figures? Because in sort of my kind of world, I often think that the government is the father figure, the NHS is the mother figure. What happens if we feel the parental figures in our life didn't tell us all of the truth? And I think that's a very destabilizing process for many people. So I think that it is often an easy defense mechanism to say, let's just move forward, forget about that. We don't need to. But from my perspective, you have to learn from the past, otherwise you're going to repeat the future. And that's just my clinical stuff. I've got to look at someone suffering today, and actually, is that psychologically connected to their past lived experiences? And often it is.
And that brings quite close, Jane, to the point that you had mentioned previously about what lessons can we learn from South Africa in terms of truth and reconciliation. How does that work?
Well, many people may remember, but in South Africa, after the apartheid, Archbishop Desmond Tutu set up a commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that was specifically a process where all the stakeholders, everybody could come and be heard and acknowledge each other. And I think maybe this kind of process would be really, really helpful from where we're at now, because it isn't about attaching blame or pursuing people. Some individuals may be taking that course of action, but more generally, it is about accepting a situation and hearing everybody as to where they are at, where they were at, and very specifically, as Christian says, making sure we don't go there again. In my work as a mediator, many of the times the people say, what I really want is for this not to happen again, and specifically not to happen to someone else again. And I think these are very important lessons for us to learn. So mediation is always a process of, I had to go through that, but I would really like to learn for myself and enable others to learn from that process.
But what would be going through the minds of the people who are in that position to make that step? Because, I mean, people are people, Christian. When we're faced with challenging situations, we ourselves personally don't want to go down that route. So we will naturally hesitate. Is that where political and scientific leadership is? Are they looking at self-preservation?
I don't know. And I think that's the bit I find that it's very difficult to get into the understanding and the mind of other people without knowing them. But it feels as if there was a stalling for time for a long while, which is why we saw so much censorship. Now, is there something else going on? Potentially, because I think there is going to be a lot of needing to self-preservate. I think that you get to a point where you have to make a decision on certain things, which is, do I double down, or do I start to kind of listen to the other side more? And I think those are kind of, when you're looking at conflict in terms of escalation, it's where are we going to go? Are we going to go up and keep escalating, or actually are we going to come down? And I think that might be where we're at the moment. What is the strategy of leaders now? Are we going to keep going along with the narrative, or are we now going to put in certain mitigation? Are we going to see certain admissions of some kind of fault? Maybe they're just small bits, but is it a drip feed onto a bigger bit? I don't know, but it's an interesting thing, because as you say, people are people, and we often find it very difficult to admit when there have been failures or whatever, or we've got it wrong. People often don't want to lose face, But also then you've got the bigger picture, and Jane, in your roles that you've had, you'll know that this is also going to be about big companies and government responses, and there's been a lot of money being pumped into this industry. So where does that take us as well? So there has to be those aspects that are taken into account of people's decisions. So even though it is driven by people, I think there are far bigger issues and stakeholders inside the process of escalation or de-escalation.
And that brings right in, I was recently watching this recollection about what happened with Merck and Vioxx in about the 2000s, when they had to pull back, and so many people had heart issues because of it, and Merck had to pay out billions of dollars in compensation. If you imagine being the mediator when you're talking to the Merck management at that time, what would you be saying to them?
So mediation, one of the steps in mediation is what we call reality testing. So what's the real situation here? It's opening the story up, if you like, from, there's one narrative and it's about being right or wrong, to say this isn't about judgment and being right or wrong. It's about understanding the perspective, and as Christian says, from every stakeholder's perspective, what's really going on here. What are our options, and what are our criteria for choosing between those options? So, we could carry on with this narrative, and where would that take us? Where would that take us in the view of our reputation, in view of our shareholders? So it is taking into account all of those perspectives and then making a decision that works for the company in the long term. So I think, as Christian says, we all want to save face, and professionals want to save face more than anything. And what is being questioned is professional integrity. And that's very, very hard to have your professional integrity questioned, whether you're a doctor or a chairman or a CEO of a company. Your professional integrity is being questioned here. How do you step up and say, actually, I'm now looking at this from a much wider perspective, and I've reality tested this, and I can make a different call on this because of what I now see.
Yeah, and these are some big conversations, and they're not easy conversations. And I'm going to bring something into the discussion, because I think that part of the problem is we don't actually have the time to just reflect. What I mean is that sometimes, say for instance, when you have the Hillsborough situation and there was a crush on, many people died, you then have many years to review what happened and to look at it, and that's well and good. But there are some situations where you don't have that time, and you need to move very quickly in order to mitigate. And so I'm going to show an image here, and this is from some recent work. I've only done this presentation on Thursday. I was doing my own analysis looking at COVID-19, non-COVID mortality across the different sections of the population. And this is what it looks like here. And what it's showing here is our, I guess, control group in purple is unvaccinated. And what everybody seems to be happy about is that in the third booster, greater than 21 days, and ever vaccinated, it seems that this is wonderfully below the unvaccinated. And that's all well and good. That's great. However, we have a problem. When we look at second dose greater than 6 months, that's significantly above the unvaccinated. And what's even more concerning is first dose, people who, for whatever reason, only took one dose. This is significantly higher risk in terms of non-COVID deaths. And more critically, we are seeing that these two are trending together. So my anticipation could be that this is now going to trend beyond the purple line and come closer to this. This is where we are now And the problem is if we don't do some acknowledgement, this group here, who is, in my view, the most important group to identify, why did they take only one vaccine? What was it? Did they have an adverse event after it? What made them not take the second dose? Does this mean they're at risk? We need to know this so that we can mitigate it if possible. This is the reality that I'm talking about. So I do understand that, yes, we do need to reflect, but there is a critical bit of acknowledgement in terms of patient morbidity and mortality. We don't necessarily have time to just watch. How do we do this?
You can see we're both kind of stumped.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the big question.
It is the big question, isn't it? And it's how do you encourage people to speak up? What I guess you go back to this question of fear. What is it that people are afraid of? What is the fear that stops people from acknowledging that? And that needs to be explored and spoken about, I suppose. Is it fear from your medical licensing body? Is it fear from your trust, your medical trust, that stops you from acknowledging that? Is it in organizations? It's usually fear of consequences. My job will be at risk. My professional standing will be at risk. I will be delisted or whatever. Are those the fears that are driving the failure to speak about this? Because normally we speak about our fears more openly. So there's something that's holding people back and stopping them from speaking about what they may be seeing in clinical practice, as you have alluded to, Philip.
It's challenging because I think that, as you said, I've just put that together. So, I haven't actually showed many people. And so I'm realizing that I'm now looking at this information and recognizing the importance of it. The problem is that if you show it to an individual, and even within the clinical or scientific context, the first response is to look inwards, to ask yourself, is that me? What is my personal risk? What about my family? And it then impacts on the objectivity and the scientific analysis that needs to be done. How do we fix that? Because for the public, we have time, in a sense, to just look at it. But from a clinical perspective and a scientific perspective, I am not sure if we have time. I think we are at the brink of another significant transition, like what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. And then, as you will remember, many people just didn't think it would happen.
I think the bit that Jane was talking about, I feel are the conscious reasons. So people can be afraid and they can recognize what they're afraid of, and then they can make a choice based on that fear. And everyone's fear response is going to be very, very different. Some people are going to face it, some people are going to run away from it. But I think there are also some unconscious processes that are playing out here. And we've kind of all probably heard of cognitive dissonance and things like that. We've got two conflicting stories going on here. We've got a belief, and then someone's given us a bit of information that contradicts that belief. We kind of just ignore it. Human beings are very, very, I don't know if smart's the right word here, but we have a real kind of knack for being able to just discredit information. So one of the other things that is going to be going on is when you are presenting that data, what's going to happen in the unconscious as well? What information are they going to allow to happen? Because as you rightly say, there's lots of things that could play out. One of them will be, what does that mean for me and my family? One of the very first bits of work I did way back last year, I was trying to understand why lots of people were attacking the vaccine injured. Why were everyday folk telling them that they were liars, spreading misinformation, in it for money, all of that? And I spent a lot of time just wanting to understand. And at some point, someone said something that I thought, wow, that's really interesting. When eventually they started by saying, I just want them to shut up. I don't want to listen to it. But eventually they said to me, I don't want to know there's something like a ticking time bomb in me. And I thought, whoa, I didn't anticipate that to come out, because I thought they were very angry. And then I realized that anger is often a response to fear. So there was a barrier that came up saying, I just want this to go away. I just want us to move on, forget about it. So that's just one example of, I think, of some of the unconscious things that are going on for people here. So we've got the things that Jane was mentioning, the fear, and then you've got the unconscious processes that are, I think, are stopping. And that's, I think you're going to find that in the clinical setting as well, because lots of medics will not think there is a problem. Mm. They really do not think there is a problem. But there are other ones who are speaking out going, I'm seeing such a different presentation and more worrying things than I've seen before. And they're making the connection. So I think it is everyone's experiences and what makes people different. I don't totally know. I'm trying to understand that more. Why do some people connect the dots and other people don't connect the dots? But this is the thing that I think you're alluding to here. The clinicians and the scientific community don't have that time. If your graph and you're saying those two lines are starting to merge and one of them is going to go a lot higher, or they're both going to go a lot higher than the control group, then actually we need to be looking at mitigation circumstances very, very soon, rather than have that luxury, as you were saying, of just kind of waiting and see.
Yeah, these are big conversations, and it is, even now talking about it feels heavy. It is a heavy discussion, but it has to be done. I'm trying to think of a parallel. I don't know if anybody has a parallel as to what would be the equivalent to where we are now. Is there any other situation that happened that has this weight of people not wanting to look at it? And this is interesting, is that it's not just the leadership who don't want to look at it, but also the public doesn't want to look at it. It's a very strange situation, which is why people just want to move on. Go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say, sort of more than any, you talked about Hillsborough and so on, but I think more than anything, every single person is involved in this particular issue. We've all been involved in it as individuals, as well as members of society, as well as being, interacting with the medical profession. So we have different roles in it, and also it being connected to the medical profession and decisions made by government. As Christian said, those are two organizations where we look up to them. We hope they're going to protect our interests. So there are lots of conflicting issues. And that when Christian was talking about feelings, I think one of the things that comes out in mediation often is feelings of guilt, feelings of regret, those kind of things come out, doing things because of the pressure, because of social pressure. Most of us reacted as we did because of a narrative and because of social pressure that was placed upon us, and that we have to come to terms as individuals with our own understanding of the situation, and that's very hard for us to do.
Can I say something just then as well? Because I think we're talking about some really fundamental emotional words. We've talked about fear and shame and guilt, and they are huge drives to make people change their behaviors, and that's known. The behavioral scientists of the world know that you can use those three aspects to get people to change their behavior. So this is another reason why people don't want to move away from the narrative, because they were nudged into thinking a certain way. Be very afraid. Don't kill your granny. You will feel guilty if you do this. There was a promotion of using social disapproval. I remember kind of authority figures saying, yes, we want to shame people into mask wearing and things like that. And these are the knock-on effect. The things that we're talking about now are the knock-on effects that are known when you use unethical psychology on the population. that there's going to be longer term problems. You might get short term fixes. You might get someone to change their behavior short term, but longer term, there's huge consequences. And now one of those consequences is exactly what we're just saying, and Jane kind of reiterated, is, well, the authority figures who are supposed to protect me, what's going on here now? I don't want to believe that. I don't want to see it. So there is a big part of the population who would not want to accept that something was done to them, that they were hoodwinked or things like that. So I think this is a really complicated area, and the psychology of it is really important. But as I'm even sitting here, I can feel myself self-censoring for fear of what's the repercussions for me for just speaking my truth. And I've been someone who's talked out quite a lot, but it's that. So then that goes back to Jane's point, which is there is also then, once you start to look and you start to acknowledge, oh, wow, okay, do I then just shut up and move on? Do I become someone that just wants to go along with the rest of the world now, forget about what I've just seen because now I'm scared? And this to me is really tricky, because we don't know how this is going to play out. And as you said, are we at a position like in March 2020 when we don't think anything bad's going to happen? It's over there, it's another part of the world, it's not going to hit us. So everyone was thinking it'll be okay, then bang, we're in a completely different world. Are we at another cusp, as you're kind of hinting at here? Could this be another real shift? And I don't know, but it feels we need to be exploring that. The scientists need to be looking and preparing, because if we can prepare for a problem, then we will be able to protect and make sure that people that do need the help get the help. So I've gone off on a tangent there, but I'm still fascinated that the three topics that I struggle with most in my clinical practice, well, mainly shame and guilt especially, and then fear, when you've got health anxiety and all those aspects, they're huge. But these three words have already emerged, and we're only sort of 30 minutes into talking.
Yeah. And somebody raises a point here that I'm going to throw into the mix because it was such an interesting point. Is this the origin of COVID? Is a simulation. It is unbelievable that the public is not demanding answers. It's almost as if we don't want to know. We're afraid to look at it because there's no other logical reason why this wouldn't be at the top of our priority. Where did it come from and why was it created? Nobody wants to ask.
And I think you're completely right, because first of all, it's a lot easier if it's nature. This just happened. Brilliant. So I think it was very easy then to say any lab leak or it's man-made was easily told it's not true, because people didn't want to believe it was true or it could be true. It's just a lot easier to think nature just happened. And so I think that the similarities are very, very right here, because what does it mean if it was created in a laboratory? Then means, well, was it released deliberately or was it a leak? And what does that mean? Are we funding more research in this area? Could we be meaning that we will have another pandemic that's man-made? It opens up such a Pandora's box that people are terrified, and unconsciously, as I say, they choose to not go there. I think that it is one of the biggest areas. I've been saying from the start, why are we not demanding answers to this question? But it is fear.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Jane. Yes.
I was going to say, I suppose I have a question of Christian, actually, is that if we don't acknowledge this and have some kind of reconciliation, what does it mean for a society to continue to live in denial with fear, shame, and guilt, and for for a majority of the population of society to be living in that state? I wonder what that means for us as a society, not to confront this and deal with it, but to suppress it and not to have some kind of process that enables us to have a dialogue, have a debate, and come to terms with where we're at as individuals, but also as a society.
I suppose it's a little bit like therapy. We know that if we just kind of bottle up emotions, we bottle up feelings, they come out in different ways, whether that's in dreams or in how we relate to different people, our future relationships, all these things. So it seeps out in similar but different guises. And I think that that could happen here. Do we then get a learned behavior that we don't want to know? We don't want the truth because it's too painful. So does it set a precedent that we start to kind of look away? I don't know what it means on a population. I suppose potentially what it means is that we hand over responsibility for ourselves and individuals and as a community to governments, to authority figures, because we don't want to deal with that. It's a little bit like thinking, I just want mum and dad to kind of look after me. You hope then, as long as you've got a good mum and dad, you're all good. But you also want to individuate and become your own person in your own right. You don't want to get to sort of 40 and think, I want to be looked after. You want to individuate. And so I think what we're doing by not asking these questions is stifling growth of the population. It feels that it becomes smaller, and we're abdicating difficult decision making to governments and to other things. And as I say, you just hope they're going to have your best interest. But
And it raises a strange question as you were talking there, because as you were discussing some of the questions that people ask themselves about society, how would this have been different to what the German society would have had to go through in terms of the reflections and the learnings that they had to have facing some of those difficult decisions? Would this be that much different? Because that would have been extremely painful for them.
It's an emotive topic, isn't it? You bring this one up, and it's one that people shy away from ever making comparisons or.
Well, I'm not making a comparison in terms of. I'm making a point that when as a population, if you then come to a realization for whatever reason, how do you incorporate that so that you learn from it? And this is what they had to do, something that was quite difficult. And this is what I'm saying is that would have been extremely difficult as a society. How is that different?
I would go back, Philip, to the idea of South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because I think that was a process. I'm not sure there was a process in Germany, but there was a process in South Africa which said if we're going to move forward, we need as a society to have some place where people can come without blame and judgment, but simply because they want to come forward and to process their own thoughts and feelings and be part of something that enables the whole society to move forward. And I would encourage anybody who's listening, and I myself would be very happy to facilitate that kind of process. I think it's what we need really right now. I think we do need dialogue, open, honest dialogue. That's the first stage of mediation. It's all about the conversation. It's all about talking. It's all about being open and honest, but without having judgment, without having reprisals. It's not about who's right or wrong. And I think one of the things we're so afraid of is this sense of being right or being wrong or being held accountable. And it's much more about how do we have the dialogue about this? How do we even begin that discussion in a way that we can process for ourselves as individuals and as a society what we've experienced and how we don't end up in the same situation again.
And I think that there's something so important in that. You use the word process, what's happened. People are too frightened to speak up and talk about what's gone on, so they don't process it.
Yeah.
And I think when people start to understand and feel differently and they want to talk, if they are frightened of being labelled as something, they're not going to talk open and freely and then the thinking doesn't evolve. So they might immediately come to, this is my position. But if they're allowed to speak freely and not have name calling, that position can shift quite a lot. But if you don't, then it stays stuck.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got words that are so, and words to me are so powerful. You know, I get, you know, people have said to me, you called me names for working with the vaccine injured. You know, you must be, you know, they're a bunch of anti-vaxxers, those vaccine injured. It makes no sense to me that you can call people who have taken a vaccine anti-vax, but it becomes a word that gets thrown out because people don't want to have a conversation. They want to shut you down. So when that happens, people get stuck and they don't move and they get entrenched in their position. And I think that's where we're getting, is lots of people entrenched in positions, not allowing each other to explore stories. And it is all about fear. So as we were saying, the people that are attacking people is because they don't want things to be different. They don't want the viewpoint of the world to move. And people that are stuck here, often they're frightened that, well, I'm, you know, what's the reprisals for my job and all that. So I'm fascinated by mediation because, you know, I've seen it work wonders in terms of we're never going to move forward. And actually the first point, as you said, which to me is, you know, I'm a therapist, this is what I do. We get people to talk. And, you know, my favorite phrase was, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And I think that, you know, we need to sometimes just and listen more. And if we can do that, then we start to shift everyone's position changes. And that's the bit that isn't happening at the moment, but it will happen. That's my cat.
Philip, could I explain the mediation process very briefly?
Yes.
So what you might imagine is 2 triangles, and, you know, those are maybe two parties in a mediation. And at the top of each triangle, I would imagine it as an iceberg. We talk about what we call the pin iceberg model. So at the top of the iceberg, you've got people's positions. So each person has got their own position and they both believe they're right, but they're polar opposites. They're completely opposite. But underneath the iceberg, 9/10 of an iceberg is under the surface. So when we're in a defensive and maybe even an adversarial conversation, we rely on our positions and we argue from those positions. What we do in mediation is we go under the surface and we look at what are the needs, what are the interests, what are the fears, what are the concerns, what are the beliefs, what are the values, all of the stuff that we're not talking about. And one of the exercises I use very often in my training, which is with corporations, is to say, choose something, deliberately choose something that you are at polar opposites about. And then we go through a process where we listen to each other, but we listen on the level of understanding what your fears, your concerns, your needs, your interests, all of that stuff is about. And that makes all the difference, because then people say, I can see that. I may not still agree with you at the position point, but I do agree that I can understand where your beliefs come from, where your values come from. And so people move towards each other.
You know, I'm reflecting on something, and I'm seeing lots of comments that you can't see, and there's still a lot of angry people out there about what has happened in the pandemic. And I'm going to share a clinical conversation that I say to patients. Oftentimes, say for instance, usually the husband is drinking too much. The wife has been saying for years, you're drinking too much. And then something happens and they're in front of the clinician, and the clinician then says, you're drinking too much. Okay. And what I have to then say to the wife in that situation, I need you to not speak. I need you to not say, I told you so. Because if you say, I told you so, you will entrench the position of the other person. They will get defensive and they can't deal with it. And it's almost a plea to those who were saying the correct things all along. In a sense, you almost can't say it in order for people to have that process of reflection. If there is continuously in front of you that you were wrong, I am right,
Yeah.
it worsens the situation. How do you fix that?
Well, you fix it by saying, certainly in a mediation, you just emphasize it isn't about right or wrong. It's not about judgment. I, as the facilitator, am not here to make any kind of judgment, to be an expert, to form any kind of opinion. I'm here to facilitate the dialogue, the conversation, even if that's a group process. And this is what we explore. We're exploring what are people's thoughts, feelings, where are they at, and very much facilitating a listening process. It is about listening. So in mediation, as you speak, you listen to yourself, then you listen to other people. One of the jobs the mediator does is to summarize and reflect back what they're hearing. So the process of listening goes round and round. And one of the podcasts I was listening to recently was 7,000 Ways of Listening. Listening is a very, very deep process. It's something we don't do, and certainly we don't do very much in corporate or organizational life or in government. But this process of deep listening is the process that gets us to understanding, acceptance and acknowledgement, and then enables us to move forward. So it is a deep process. It's something that takes time, which is why something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission it is a process. It isn't something that happens quickly. It's something that takes time.
And I guess the point, though, that as I'd mentioned before, that I'm concerned about is we don't actually have a lot of time. We need to do the research, because if the first step is acknowledgement that there is a problem, the second step is to say, okay, if there is a problem, what exactly is it? And what can we do to mitigate it? And those bits take time. And so the longer there is an acknowledgement that there could be a problem, the less likely it is that we are able to mitigate.
I think you're right. And I think that, just listening to what Jane was saying, feelings are the key here to me. When we're talking about facts, as soon as you present that data, someone's going to be thinking, what's my comeback? They're not listening to what you're saying. They're instantly, I don't like that graph, so I'm just going to pull up in my head the graph that I saw 2 years ago that's going to debunk yours. So they're not listening to the data. We need to get to the feelings below, and I think that's the graph. And I think I know the graph you were talking about, Jane, because actually the pyramid underneath the icebergs, or the pyramid, is where we're all connected.
Yes.
To me, it's what are you worried about? That's what I say to everyone from different sides. What is it you're worried about? Or I will sometimes say, look, what I'm worried about is I just don't want to see people get hurt, and I'm seeing people get hurt, and I'm finding it really difficult. And someone goes, well, that's the same thing as me. I think that you're crazy for having these views, and people are going to get hurt. And then you can kind of hone in. And that's why I love a mediator or a facilitator, something to hone in and go, okay, so you've actually got this real common goal here. Yep. You're all really frightened right now.
Yeah.
And and the same thing. Then you've got some common grounds. You go, so help take me through your thought process about what's happening. And it's, again, what you were saying, Philip, by that point, hopefully the other person is now open to listening. So you don't have to say, I need you to not speak, because they're realizing, actually, we've got more in common than I realized. So this is the bit that if we could get some kind of sort of open debate going, and it was facilitated well, I think we could move forward, because you are right. There is so much anger on both sides, and everyone feels extremely justified about their anger. We need to understand we're all coming on the same page, really. We're all trying to protect something or frightened of something. So I still think it's about how do we facilitate good, honest conversation and dialogue where people are not just talking about facts, but they're also talking about feelings.
Yep.
Here's an interesting thing. Susan I'd interviewed her recently, so I'm showing one of her comments here. So she had been in vaccine regulation, so she knows the background. And she says something here: it's difficult to give credit to the vaxxers for wanting to protect others when they attack those not willing to accept the narrative and called us selfish and accused us of being the problem. And this is the reality of how a lot of people feel, and their anger at, because they did lose quite a lot: jobs, finance, family, friends, and they are still hurting from that.
But they haven't been heard, and this is one of the huge things that's happened. Is the discrimination that took place was off the chart. I've never experienced something where we were supposed to be in this society where we're calling out discrimination anywhere, and that's wrong, but because it was a government approved form of discrimination, people turned a blind eye to it. And so people have not felt validated, they have not felt heard, they have felt, and they have lost out so much, and relationships are broken down, which is something a lot of us was speaking about in 2020, way before all this was anything to do with the vaccine was about. It was, if this isn't done well, this will break down relationships. And that's where we're at right now. People, like that comment you just made, that's someone who has probably experienced some awful things, and there's been no acknowledgement of actually how bad that was, and that was wrong, and there to be any accountability. There hasn't been any of that. So I think that's why we're very, very stuck.
Yeah. And we haven't even touched, Jane, what this could mean from company points of view. If there are people at, when you think about what happened at universities across the Western world, if there was damage, how there is liability that comes with that. What are they likely to be thinking? This is why I'm saying it's one of those situations where everybody just kind of hopes it goes away.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a practicing lawyer anymore, as you mentioned at the beginning, so I can't comment on what a company's or individual's liability might be. But certainly there may be people who may choose to take action. And of course, what we do in the English legal system is we look for case studies, and we look for cases or people bring joint actions. So these may be in the pipeline. I don't know. And of course, more than just a vaccine injury, there may be people who've lost jobs, who were excluded from jobs, who've suffered trauma. So there may be all sorts of situations that people feel aggrieved by if they consider taking action. And again, you can use a mediation process in that, in addressing that. So again, it would be important for organizations to be thinking about their strategy, and not only that, but to be planning ahead for what happens if there's another crisis where we have to think and act quickly. One of the things I've said, and I've chaired for the last 4 years or so an organizational board, and I would ask at board level, on what criteria do we make this decision? And I think that's an important thing for organizations to think about when they're faced with a crisis, is how do we make this decision? What criteria do we make this decision on? What risk analysis have we done? And I think, again, when you're thrown into a situation, often those things go out of the window, and the risk analysis is not done. The long-term consequences are not thought about or even imagined. And I was recording a podcast myself yesterday, which was looking at why we need to have in our organizations what we would call more lateral rather than linear thinkers, people who are able to look at the big picture and to imagine all kinds of different consequences to help us to think through complex problem solving. What we're talking about here is complexity, and our brain doesn't like complexity. Our brain likes simplicity. So we look for a simple narrative and a simple solution. What we now faced with is a very complex situation, which has multiple stakeholders, multiple issues. And how do we unravel that in a way that helps us understand what has happened, what could happen, what the outcome might be. And again, as a mediator, one of the questions I ask people is, what outcome would you like? What outcome are you trying to find? And that's a good starting place to think, let's look at the future and say, where do we want to get to, rather than who's right and who's wrong?
Yeah, these are important questions because, as I said, we are at a transition point, and it really needs big discussion,
Yes.
big decisions, and without it, and this is again come back to it, it's an unusual situation where I don't think we have the time or the luxury to spend too much time just reflecting. We need to get some answers very, very quickly. What should leaders do, and what are the likely thing that they're going to do? That's I guess, the psychology, the mediation part of it.
I would suggest that, some kind of committee or forum is set up, even if you can't set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which looks at helping many, many people. There is an opportunity to set up some kind of committee which could welcome this debate and this discussion, this difficult conversation, start the ball rolling, have a look at some of the problems that you're highlighting, Philip, as they are presented now, and say, where do we go from here? So I think you can start small, but with an intention to have a conversation, have a debate, open up the discussion with some ground rules about, this isn't about judgment, this is about a dialogue, and it's about decision making, and it's about looking forward to the outcomes we want to achieve. I think it's having a framework around a dialogue that enables people to feel safe. So, when we're looking at people reacting from fear, that's because they don't feel safe. Can you create, what we do in mediation is we create a safe space and a safe process. It's confidential. It has ground rules. It has a process that we work through, and that enables people to feel safe in managing the dialogue.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, any thoughts about that, Christian, from the psychological point of view? You must have seen those people who have to face very difficult situations. What do you say to them?
Well, I think that it's something that Jane's spot on. We need to be encouraging the dialogue between the two different sides on all the arguments, but there has to be ground rules. It's a little bit like sometimes when I've run psychological groups in the past, I didn't really want to have ground rules, but it felt you kind of got to, and you make them kind of straightforward. And one of them is, what the main rule I have is, we have to put our feelings into words rather than into actions. So, and then people look at me a bit odd, and what do you mean? I go, well, if I annoy you, tell me I'm annoying you, don't hit me with the chair. And we can kind of have a bit of a laugh about it. Look, we're all human, we're all coming from the same place. Let's get these ground rules established, and having a mediator in there who is neutral, having an independent observer, which is something that I was wanting to do quite early at a point last year. There were certain topics that people were arguing greatly, and people sort of within communities were starting to fragment because they were really entrenched. If you believe this, then you're not on my side. And what I wanted to do with that was to do mediation and have it done properly. And that's what needs to be done here. In a way, we would hope, and it just doesn't happen, we would hope, and maybe it did historically, I don't know, that the media would be holding to account and be bringing different sides to the argument. That is not happening. And we cannot rely on the media to do that. And I think somehow we have to start, if we can't get an independent inquiry that is truly independent, do we start small? Do we start doing this ourselves and having conversations in a committee kind of forum? That could do something. I know that that's going to take time, but we have to start somewhere. We have to get the ball rolling. And at the moment, we're not allowing this side and this side. And I hate the fact that it's sides, but sometimes it feels like we end up in tribes and all that. But we're not getting them together in the safe environment that Jane is describing. where you can actually say everything and we can get it out and people don't feel that they're going to be judged, they're going to get attacked for having a view. We can start that place where people feel very safe, contained environment, put it all out there on the table, you know, spew it all up. That's what I say to my patients, that my table here is get it all out, you know, and then my job is sometimes to sift through it and give it back to each other in more manageable chunks. Because a lot of the time, some of our stuff is connected to other stuff. It's not connected to this moment that we're talking about. So having skilled facilitators is key to moving forward, I think.
Yeah.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. So as we come to the end, this is, as I said, I can sense this is a big discussion. And, you know, even as we're talking about it, I can feel how difficult it's going to be to start. But it has to be done at some point. So in our closing thoughts, where do we go from here? You want to start, Jane?
I do think we need to start somewhere. I don't know where that should be, but I think there should be, you know, people should think about starting conversations. I'm happy to give people some ground rules. I'm happy to facilitate those. If people want to start where they are, whether that's in their local community, whether that's in their healthcare trust, whether, you know, wherever that is, I think with a process, we could start with small conversations, but to get the conversations going, I think is the key. And they we just need to get going. We just need to start, really. And then that builds confidence in people that, you know, when people come to mediation, they're often very afraid, and then they go away and they actually say, I kind of enjoyed that. You know, it was a process that actually did something very positive for me. So I think you would find very positive outcomes just from people beginning this process.
Excellent. And Christian, your final thoughts?
It's a bold one. You've got Jane here. You know, it feels to me that you've got a platform, you've got access to different speakers. Could you do something? Could we bring together people from differing views where it is safe to discuss this? Might not be live, it might not, because people might feel too frightened, they might not be able to speak, but could we start small? Could we start something here? I would be happy to be involved in absolutely anything there, but it has to start somewhere. And there's a lot of talk, and that's right, but eventually we have to go, okay, how do we put this into action? And so that would be my thing is, Philip, could we all do something?
Yeah, I mean, I just realized as I was talking that in a sense we are actually starting that process, because we are speaking about it and we are speaking about something. And as I said, as we were talking, I could feel that it was heavy, it was hard, but we have managed to go through that conversation, reflecting on some of the implications, but still being able to come out of the other side saying, actually, if we do this, there is chances that we can make a difference. That's the point that I think. I feel very similar to where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. Many people didn't want to talk about it because they were afraid. They ignored it. For me, I thought, let's think about it. Let us plan for it. Let's try and mitigate it. Let's try and look at ways to creatively save lives. Don't just let it happen. And I think that this is exactly where we are, in a different way, where we also have to deal with some very worrying and scary circumstances, but we still have to do it.
I think I said to you right at the beginning, Philip, that the greatest virus is the virus of fear.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I really, 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 and the one thing that if you can get people together, it's, you know, it's okay to fall out. You know, it's okay to disagree. That's fine. It's just, how do we fall and how do we then come back together afterwards?
That's right.
That's the key. And so I do think if you can get skilled facilitators, you can get people who are willing to take a risk of being in a room with someone who thinks completely differently.
Yeah.
I think you could start something huge.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Wonderful. Well, I thank you both very much for joining me. I'll ask you to hang on as we do this outro. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. As usual, we have very deep, profound conversations. Really appreciate our speakers to be sharing their time and expertise. I hope you found this valuable. And until we meet again, have a great evening. Thank you.